Hello, my name is Melinda Lee, and I'm a member of the Worship Associate Team of the First Unitarian Universalist Society of Burlington, Vermont. Unitarian Universalists come from many traditions and spiritual backgrounds, and we welcome all who share in our commitment to build a world based on justice, compassion, peace, and respect for the environment. So whoever you are, wherever you are from, or wherever you are going, you are welcome here today. To learn more about our society, you can click on the link at the end of this video or go to our website. Feel free to tell us who you are, and if you wish, we can get back to you to answer any questions you might have. A special thanks to our musicians today, Wayne Schneider on the organ, Sam Whitesell on the piano, and James Stewart, our musical director, and for the videographers who made this online production possible. We are about to begin. So you can get a chalice or a candle, or if you wish, a beverage, and get comfortable. Come. Let us worship together. As I light the chalice, please join me in our chalice lighting words. We kindle this chalice flame to remind ourselves of the light of truth, the warmth of community, and the fire of commitment.
The call to worship today is from the work of the Reverend Nancy MacDonald Ladd. She writes, "When we say save the rainforest, we don't mean that we cease to honor the mighty cedars or the reaching pines. We mean that one particular piece of a deeply sacred whole is more at risk than others, and that this risk, this threat, is worthy of our very bravest actions. So it is with Black lives in this country. And the message that Black Lives Matter is important so long as this nation effectively functions as if they do not."
Good morning. My story today is inspired by a post I read on Facebook last week. And since I don't know all the details of that true story, I've had to imagine most of them. And the story I'll tell could really take place anywhere, even right here in Burlington, Vermont. It's the story about a little girl named Anna. Anna lives in an apartment building in the middle of her city with her grandmother. Anna's grandmother's the manager of the building, so she takes care of things for all the people that live there. And she does a really good job. She likes to plant flowers, and she tells Anna that she likes the flowers because they make all the people that pass by happy. Now, this morning, something really scary happened. Anna was sleeping, and suddenly she woke up to loud noises outside. Things were smashing on the sidewalk, and somebody was yelling and screaming. When she looked out, she saw it was a grown-up, a man, and he was taking things out of the garbage and throwing them into the street, and he was digging up all of their beautiful flowers. Now, Anna had never seen a grown-up act this way, and it was really frightening. In the living room, Anna's grandma was pulling on her sandals and leaning out the window, and she called down, "Please stop. Don't call the police," to two people who were passing below and had pulled out their cell phones. Anna watched from the doorway as her grandma went outside. The man was sitting on the concrete now, flowers in his hands, roots and all. sobbing inconsolably. Anna's grandmother called an organization she knew of that helps people in crisis and asked what she could do. And they told her that in their city, if you called 911 and nobody's life was in danger, they could send mental health workers instead of the police. So that's what Anna's grandmother did. Now, remember I said that this story could happen anywhere? Actually, it could only happen somewhere where the people have made sure that there's an alternative to call when somebody's having a crisis, not just the police. Anna watched as an ambulance came and some people got out and they talked to the man. And it took a while, but eventually they were able to help him up and get him into the ambulance. As they drove away, Anna's grandmother waved and said thank you to the paramedics that had helped him. Anna helped her grandmother sweep up. Grandma, where did they take the man? They took him to a hospital where they can help him feel better. Just then, a woman came across the street. Ugh, what a mess. Just look what he did to your flowers. Horrible. I hope you called the police. Anna could tell that this made Grandma angry. But Grandma took a deep breath and said calmly, these flowers cost $6.99 each at Lowe's. They don't matter. The man who was sobbing uncontrollably on the street, that was horrible. Grandma, Anna asked, you told everyone not to call the police. Would it have been wrong to call them? Grandma said, do you remember the Black Lives Matter protest that we were part of last week? And how we talked about Black people and people of color not always being treated fairly by the police? Well, that man was Black, and I wanted to be sure that nothing bad would happen to him, nothing worse. Also, the police just aren't trained to take care of people who are sick. I'm so proud of our community for funding the crisis team that was able to help him. Grandma, I wish I had been braver and had said something kind to make him feel better. You are a very brave girl, but I'm glad you stayed inside. Anna, I wanted to say something to him too, but I guess I was just too scared. Maybe we could do that compassion meditation we tried yesterday, and we could direct it at him. And maybe we could focus our gratitude on the workers who helped him. As Anna was replanting one of the flowers, she said, Grandma, maybe we should focus our thoughts on that lady across the street too. She needs compassion too. Grandma chuckled. I'm glad you said that. I shouldn't judge her so harshly. Our society conditions us to value order and property, sometimes over people. We could all use compassion. Thank you.
As we let this music settle in, let us deepen together into a time of meditation. We will begin our meditation by sharing the joys and sorrows of our community, and then hold a brief time of silence. After the silence, I will read the poem, How to Survive the Apocalypse by Reverend Sean Parker Dennison. So now let us take a deep breath together, breathing in the breath of life, breathing out the breath of peace, and come into the place of holy listening. Let us hear these words of joy and sorrow for this day, Sunday, August 16th, 2020. Grateful to family and friends who are all the more cherished during these challenging times. Grateful to see my son, grandson, and daughter-in-law in person for the first time since Thanksgiving, even despite no touching and wearing masks. Joy for tomatoes, our garden fresh vegetables, and the bounty of a farm share. Angry and sad that Border Patrol raided the No More Deaths migrant aid camp in Arizona. And so proud of our daughter, Reverend Bethany Russell Lowe, for participating in a prayer vigil there. Just heard that my mother's second husband died overnight. He was not an easy person to be around, but he loved my mother, and they shared 2 wonderful decades together before she died 2 years ago. Sad about the end of his life, the joy the 2 of them shared. Sorrow for the people in Beirut, Lebanon, as they deal with so many deaths and so many injured, as well as the destruction of their homes and city. May the joys and sorrows of each of us be the joys and sorrows of all of us, reminding us of our shared humanity. How to Survive the Apocalypse by Reverend Sean Parker Dennison. First, learn to listen, not only for enemies around corners and hidden places, but for the faint footsteps of hope and the whisper of resistance. Hone your skills, aim your heart towards kindness, and stockpile second chances. Under the weight of destruction, we will need the stone scepter of forgiveness and the deeper well that give the sweet water of welcome. We have a place for you. When the world ends, we must not add destruction to destruction, not accept a beggar's bargain to fight death with more death. In order to survive the apocalypse, any apocalypse at all, we have to give up the counter currency of self-sufficiency, the mistake of addiction to competition, the lie that the last to die has somehow survived.
All summer long, our theme has been and is still racial justice. And because of that theme, or in concert with it, today's offering and all of this summer's offerings will be shared with local people of color-led organizations that are doing racial justice work in the greater Burlington area and throughout Vermont, including Black Lives Matter of Greater Burlington, the Alliance for Racial Justice in Vermont, Honor Their Names, and other groups identified by the racial justice team. Your gift will be shared with the groups that are doing on the front line that most important work. Thank you for your faith in the future. Thank you for your gifts. The offering will now be most gratefully received. Join me, please, in our words of dedication for today's offering. With gratitude, we dedicate these gifts in the service of our mission to inspire spiritual growth, care for each other and the community, seek truth, and act for justice. Peter and I took some road trips in July. It was lovely to spend time on beautiful back roads and, frankly, some pretty beautiful major roads too in Vermont. We both noticed something. There are Black Lives Matter signs everywhere. This was not true 6 months ago. So, what's happened? What is happening? Some groups are clearly selling yard signs. Some of them underneath the Black Lives Matter say, "Silence is violence." Lots of the signs, though, are homemade. They're painted, sometimes dramatically and clearly, and sometimes in a pretty slapdash way. They're in yards, they're along the roads, they're tacked on mailboxes. They are everywhere, which makes me glad, and I wonder what to make of it. What exactly does this change mean? Vermont is complicated. It is not a homogeneous place. I have lived here long enough already to know that. Still, things are changing. Maybe. George Floyd was murdered less than 3 months ago. During that whole time and before, we have been in a pandemic. There have been protests that whole time. The election is 79 days away. Maybe we're paying attention. VPR did a poll which was published a couple of weeks ago. The results of the poll about racism are pretty interesting. A majority of Vermonters apparently think racism is a problem in this state. Almost 60% said that racism is either a big problem or somewhat of a problem in this state. 40% said that it was a small problem or no problem at all. And 81% of respondents said their communities were welcoming of racial and ethnic diversity. Are we fooling ourselves? Do these numbers match up? Racism is complicated here in Vermont and everywhere. I want to ask you a question. Can you remember when you first heard the phrase structural racism? I think for me it was at least 20 years ago. And the message that I got from this phrase is something I already sort of knew, even back then, that racism is not just about how people treat one another. It's not just about white people discriminating against black people. Behaviors, attitudes, discrimination are signs of the racism in our society, but racism's roots are deeper and far more insidious. Here's a definition of structural racism. The historical and contemporary policies, practices, and norms that create and maintain white supremacy. The policies, practices, and norms, both now and in the past, that create and maintain white supremacy. I think if I heard this definition 20 plus years ago, I maybe didn't take it in fully. The structures of our society, the industries, the schools and universities and governments and churches, religious communities of all kinds, have policies, practices, and norms that reinforce the ideology that white people are inherently best. That's big. And we can't fix that just by changing the ways that we behave or even by the ways that we think. We have to change those behaviors and attitudes, and we must come to understand why we think that way. And then I need to acknowledge something. I'm talking today to white people, not because I hope that there are no Black, Indigenous, people of color here today. I hope there are. But I'm doing it because white people sometimes need not to be silent. Like many of you, I have learned in these last few years how important is it that when we white people stop dominating the conversation for a while, that we learn to be quiet, to listen to BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color, people who are not cisgender, people who are LGBT or differently abled. We need to make sure that those voices are centered in our community, not off in the margins. I am very grateful for all I've been able to learn because of that admonition. And I'm glad that we are, I think, finally figuring out that we must stop asking people of color to explain racism to us, even when our questions come from deeply sincere confusion or grief or guilt. And I am grateful and hopeful for the signs that we are beginning to understand where we are as a country and a world, how we got here, what it means, how we're reinforcing those practices and policies and norms. That's our work as white people. And it is a main reason that white people need to talk to and teach one another. There's a lot to learn. Some of it individually. I am so grateful and excited actually about the fact that there are, I think, 7 groups that have been organized that are working their way through the Me and White Supremacy book by Layla Saad, the prompts to interrogate one's own experience and then talk to other people about that. The groups that are not just inside this congregation, but also in the community, reading and talking about Robin DiAngelo's book, White Fragility. This is important and life-changing work. And there is also a lot to learn about the structural racism that is keeping our society, not just us as individuals, but our whole society stuck in white supremacy. And the reason that that's happening is that the systems have been designed that way. I've been learning a lot this summer, reading and catching up on some of the things I thought I needed to learn more about, and allowing myself to be led into other areas where I've learned about things I didn't know I didn't know. There are 2 stories I want to tell you a little bit about today. Both of them are complicated, both of them are important. The first is this book. It's called Dying of Whiteness. I'm going to try to hold it up for the camera. By Jonathan Metzl. It was published in 2019, and the subtitle is How the Politics of Racial Resentment is Killing America's Heartland. His argument, which he proves pretty conclusively, is that one of the many problems with white supremacy is the deep commitment to the idea of whiteness that it is and has been inculcating among lots of white people. White supremacy is not just killing people of color, he argues. It is also killing millions of low and middle income white people who do not benefit from the policies and practices and norms that they support. Everything that maintains racial hierarchy, including the insanity of our health insurance system, the less and less restrictive gun laws, and criminally underfunded schools. Wealthy, powerful people are benefiting from these systems, and poor white people are not. White people, no matter what our socioeconomic bracket, are protected from outright harassment and violence by this racial system that we got. But a lot of people are losing their lives because these policies, practices, and norms don't protect them. And some of these people know that their lives might be better with the government programs they don't support, but they are so against the idea that immigrants and welfare queens might get help using those programs that they are, he says, willing to die to protect whiteness. This book totally blew my mind and Peter's, and I would love to talk to you about it some other time, but we don't have time to get into it today. Just wanted to name it. The second story is what I've come to think of as the real story behind urban renewal. Remember urban renewal in the 1960s and 70s when I was a kid and a young adult? The idea was to revive cities that were old and not in good shape, to revive them all over the country. I personally connect urban renewal with what I think of as bad architecture. Government Center, for example, in Boston. But it's a whole lot more than that. The article that I read, that I'm going to draw from here for a minute, is by a man named Brent Sabo. He's a professor of history at the University of Pennsylvania. And what he says is that urban renewal was a federal program whose actual effect was the destruction of Black neighborhoods and businesses and churches and schools, not reviving cities at all. We have all now finally heard of the Tulsa race riot of 1921. We know something about redlining. Urban renewal, not so much. Sybil, in his article, cites the work that James Baldwin was doing in 1963. He went to San Francisco and found neighborhoods in turmoil. The city was seizing properties by eminent domain, razing the buildings on them, and turning the properties over to private developers. At least 5,000 families, 20,000 residents, the majority of them people of color, were being displaced. This is in the mid-60s, at exactly the same time that civil rights legislation was securing voting rights and the desegregation of public and private spaces. At that very same time, the federal government unleashed this program that enabled local officials to simply clear out entire Black neighborhoods. At its peak in the mid-1960s, urban renewal displaced a minimum of 50,000 families every year, not just in the big cities, many mid-sized and small cities too. There were more than 1,200 projects, and altogether, at least 300,000 families were displaced, more than 1.2 million Americans. Black Americans in 1960 were 13% of the total population, and at least 55% of the people displaced. So here's the backstory to that. We all know now about the Great Migration in the earlier decades of the 20th century, when 6 million Black people fled Jim Crow in the South to the northern cities to get jobs. Many of them did get jobs. It was very hard to find a place to live because the cities were defining their white neighborhoods and defending the boundaries of those neighborhoods pretty fiercely, which meant that the Black neighborhoods had more and more and more people coming into them. The housing and the schools were overcrowded. Municipal and county budgets during this time were teetering on the edge of fiscal catastrophe, partially because of the lingering effects of the Great Depression and then the New Deal, which helped people cost a lot of money. Local officials were desperate to grow their tax base. They took properties that did not produce enough tax revenue, and they made them available to developers. They made them available for wealthy white people to make money in commercial developments, and those commercial developments in turn made money for the city. Public housing did not. Just one example, Lincoln Center, when it was built in New York City, displaced 4,000 families, many of them Puerto Rican immigrants, but also Black and Asian American and other minorities. Also, universities and hospitals that developed wonderful new campuses in the middle of cities like Chicago, Oklahoma City, Detroit, Philadelphia, Cleveland, Boston, Charleston, West Virginia. Professor Siebel says this about the overall effect. While private-public practices such as redlining help explain the staggering racial wealth gap, urban renewal involved kinds of theft more difficult to quantify, thefts that amount to the destruction of entire life worlds. One last note. Many of these projects failed, of course, leaving the cities under pressure to find other ways to make money, to boost property values. One of those ways was through aggressive policing. In the wake of Michael Brown's killing, the Department of Justice found that Ferguson, Missouri's harsh policing of Black residents was the result of a systemic effort to raise revenue through tickets, through fees, through arresting people. And in Louisville, Kentucky, the police who invaded Breonna Taylor's apartment and killed her were connected, we think, to a special police squad, and her family asserts that the warrants that they were acting on were meant to address roadblocks to a multi-million-dollar redevelopment initiative in Louisville. This is our country. This is our time. This is our history. These are our practices and policies and norms. We need to know them. We cannot change them until we understand what has actually happened. So the purpose of religious community, what the heck is it? It used to be that a lot of people thought that the purpose of a religious community was to tell everybody what the truth is so they can align their lives according to God's will or according to some acquired wisdom. Unitarian Universalism's real purpose, though this is not always the way we behave, is to create and cultivate communities within which people can access wisdom together and then share it. Some fundamentals are unchanging. We think of our 7 principles, but much of the wisdom that we draw from and on which we try to align our lives is always evolving as we learn. Our search is never finished, and we aren't finished either. And we're not alone because we have each other. We are always trying to understand and do the right thing, like Anna's grandma in the story, doing braver things, as Nancy MacDonald Ladd says. I will end with some of Sean Parker Dennison's poem about surviving the apocalypse. First, he writes, "Learn to listen, not only for enemies around corners and hidden places, but for the faint footsteps of hope and the whisper of resistance. Hone your skills, aim your heart toward kindness, and stockpile second chances. Under the weight of destruction, we will need the stone scepter of forgiveness and the deeper wells that give the sweet water of welcome." So may it be. So may it blessed be.
Peace has to giving. Love will guide us through the dark night.
Say the words with me. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts and share with the world until we are together again. And our benediction today from the work of the Reverend Dr. Howard Thurman. I think we could hear this every week. I could, anyway. Do not ask yourself what the world needs, he said. Ask yourself what makes you come alive, and then go and do that. Because what the world needs is people who have come alive. Go in peace.